Welcome everybody, welcome to my virtually Instructables. I'm going to be making a series of videos on virtualization. The first one is setting up VMware Workstation Pro. Here we'll be looking at the key features of the product, how to set it up, set up the environment, set up the network, ready to install your first virtual machines. So I hope you get something out of this video, and without further delay, let's get into it. Right, so first of all, I think we'll open up VMware Workstation. You should already have this installed. This video is not going to be talking about installing VMware Workstation. It's just a piece of software. We will be installing some operating systems, however, and communicating with them via the virtual networks. So we'll look at some of the key features first of all with VMware Workstation. So I'm using Workstation 16 Pro, and out of the box we probably should look at the virtual network adapters. So let's have a look there. If you go to the edit menu, you can go down to Virtual Network Editor, and the Virtual Network Editor window opens up and it'll show you what virtual networks are installed and ready to use. If you need to change those settings, we go down to the bottom and click Change Settings. Right, so we now have visible the VMnet 0, which is a bridged network adapter. I should show you, in fact, the virtual adapters and how they interact with the physical machine. So let's get that organized. So here we have the network connections that this particular computer has access to. Yours will look different, but you will still have essentially a Ethernet adapter, and you'll have some virtual adapters. It's the virtual adapters that we're looking at the moment. If we look at our VMware virtual adapters, we have a VMnet 0, a VMnet 1, and a VMnet 8. If we look at our computer's network adapters, we have a VMnet 1 listed there and a VMnet 8 listed there. So that correlates to what we have in our virtual network adapters. The VMnet 0 doesn't appear here as VMnet 0, but it is in fact here. It's the Ethernet adapter that is in use. The virtual network editor bridges the VMnet 0 automatically to an active adapter that has access essentially to the rest of the network or the internet. If we look at the settings of the virtual network adapter VMnet 0 bridged, we can see that the radio button is selected as bridged. That will connect VMs directly to the external network. The bridging type is automatic, so we can actually select any of these adapters that are in here for that bridging. Now, we may want to do that if we have multiple active adapters that could be potentially used as a bridged adapter. So, for example, my Wi-Fi connection here, I may be able to use that. So I could select that specifically, and if I do that, then all of the virtual machines that I connect to VMnet 0 will then use the wireless adapter to access the internet. You can leave it at automatic. It shouldn't cause you too many troubles, especially if you don't have a complicated network. Otherwise, feel free to select a specific adapter, then you know that that won't change. VMnet 1 is a host-only adapter, and it appears here because we have this button ticked that says connect a host virtual adapter to this network. And it tells you what the name of the adapter is there. If I untick that and apply those changes, this adapter will disappear. The reason that I might want it connected is if I want to directly communicate with my virtual machines that are connected to VMnet 1 from my physical computer. If I don't want to do that, I can untick this box. And in a moment we'll see that this will disappear. The Use Local DHCP service is also enabled, and that means that VMware Workstation will be distributing DHCP over that network. So any virtual machines connected to that network will receive DHCP using the DHCP settings as designated in here. We won't be wanting to do that in any of my videos, so I'm going to go ahead and untick that because I will be setting up a DHCP server, in fact, on that network later on. So I definitely don't want two DHCP servers. The NAT adapter is for network address translation, can be useful for sharing your host adapter IP address with the virtual machines. At least in my initial videos, we won't be using NAT for our virtual machines at all. So again, I will remove that from the host, and I'll also remove DHCP service from that. You can, in fact, if you don't feel that you'll be using them at all, for instance, NAT, I can actually just remove that network. Because you can add more networks later, so we can add it back if we want to, or if we just want to get rid of it completely, we'll do that. Let's click apply and we'll see the changes that happen to our physical computer's network connections here. Right, so that's removed the unused virtual adapters. So I have a bridged adapter now, which is my Ethernet adapter here. And I have VMnet 1, which is a custom adapter that does not communicate with the host machine at all. It will only communicate with the virtual machines that you connect it to. Okay, so that wraps up that part in a nutshell. So we'll close all of this down and get back to VMware Workstation. We'll quickly look at some environmental variables in VMware Workstation. So we have in our file menu, we can create a new virtual machine here, and we'll be doing that shortly. But first we will want to look at our preferences. So let's look at Edit Menu, Preferences. And we have our workspace, which is the default location for virtual machines. It's a good idea to select a different location here. So first of all, I recommend finding somewhere where you are going to store your virtual machines. If you have a SSD hard drive, I certainly recommend storing your virtual machines in that space if you have enough storage area there. If you're lucky enough to have two SSDs, then you can be running your host operating system on one of your SSDs, and you can store your virtual machines on the other SSD. So I might actually browse for a suitable location for my virtual machines. So I've selected the D drive, which is also an SSD, and I've created a folder in there called Virtual Machines. So we can go down this list here, and we don't need to look at all of these things. So we might just have a quick look at the memory area here. Reserved memory. How much host RAM should the system be able to reserve for all running virtual machines? There should not be a need to change this depending on how much RAM your physical computer has and how many virtual machines you're intending to run. I'm going to make the assumption that you have a reasonable amount of RAM, more than you need for your physical computer. So you can generally leave this setting alone. This does reserve some RAM for the physical machine, so we can have set aside RAM that can't be used for the virtual machines, which hopefully will improve the performance of our physical machine. How should the system allocate memory for the virtual machines? Do we want to fit all the virtual memory into reserved host RAM, or do we want to allow some of it to be swapped, or do we want to allow most of it to be swapped? Again, if you're running a lot of virtual machines, you may want to change this. I will leave this at the default setting. I feel that I have plenty of memory to be able to run 2 or 3 virtual machines, as well as my host Windows 11 physical machine. So I'll leave that as it is. So let's click OK. The next step is to go through the process of setting up a new virtual machine. We can select typical, which are the recommended options for the type of configuration, but I'll select custom so that I can look at all of the different options as we go along. The hardware compatibility, we can look in the drop down box. We can see there are different versions of VMware. So we've got Workstation 16.2.x, which is what I'm running now. So if I use that virtual machine hardware compatibility, then that virtual machine will be suitable to be run in VMware Workstation 16 and also potentially Fusion 12.2. So they're the compatible products. If I'm making virtual machine in here, it does have ticked there compatible with ESX server. It doesn't appear in this list. Let's have a look at a slightly older version here. We've got now different compatible products. ESX 7, Workstation 15. So we can see Workstation 15 is actually compatible with ESXi 7 as well as Workstation 16.2 and Workstation 15. So this may be a more suitable option for you if you are creating virtual machines to deploy to infrastructure, or if it's for a specific product, such as you're creating a virtual machines to deploy to ESXi 6.5, then that's the hardware compatibility mode that you should select. There's limitations listed on the right for each hardware compatibility. I'm going to leave the default, which is the top setting. I won't be deploying them to any other environment, and I'll be running them only on my VMware Workstation product. You can select your installation media here, or you can select that you'll install the operating system later. We'll do that because it allows us to configure the remainder of the settings. You can select the operating system type. So we'll select Microsoft Windows. For instance, if I wanted to set up a Windows 10 virtual machine, I can select Windows 10 or Windows 10 and later, so we can have newer virtual machines, hopefully, that VMware at this point isn't specifically supporting. Give it a name, and the name is up to you, but I really recommend that you use a sensible naming convention. You can see where the virtual machine will be stored, and that's what it will be called in that folder. So I'm going to change the name of this virtual machine to Win10 VM01. So that will make that virtual machine folder inside the virtual machines area. The firmware type, what kind of boot device should this virtual machine have? You can have a BIOS firmware. You're probably familiar with the BIOS firmware, or the UEFI firmware. Windows 10 will generally be used to using a UEFI firmware type. So I'll leave it at that. I won't use secure boot. The number of processors that I want to give my virtual machine. I'm only going to give it one processor, but I might give it either a dual core or a quad core. Now this does depend on what you have available on your physical machine. Looking at your task manager, you should see that in your CPU area you have sockets and cores and logical processors. So to relate to that with our virtual machines, we can see the total processor cores are 4. So the number needs to be under the logical processors that you have available on your computer. So if I boosted this up, and it doesn't really matter whether I use multiple processors and multiple cores per processor, but eventually I'm going to get over the amount that I have available. So I won't have this error if I select an appropriate volume of cores. So this is essentially 2 processors and 6 cores is essentially simulating this CPU, even though it's only one processor. It is a 6-core processor that is also hyper-threaded, so 12 logical processors. So we'll go back and just select 1 and 4. So that's a single processor quad core, which should be fine for a virtual machine of Windows 10 if you're just using it for your administrative testing purposes. How much RAM should we give it? 2 gig is the default setting here, I noticed. You can use the slider to change the amount of RAM, or you can just type in an amount of RAM. So I'll give it 4 gig of RAM. And here we can look at the network type, and you can choose this at the time, or you can say do not use a network connection. Because I want to specifically connect it to a network later, it may be a good idea for me to not do this yet, or I may want to set it up using the bridged networking and then change it later. A reason for that may be because I want to run some Windows updates before I use it. The I/O controller types can be left at the default settings. It will select the recommended type for you. Other types may not be recommended or available. The same with the disk type. You can generally, unless you have reason to change, you can leave it at the default setting. And we'll create a new virtual disk here. The new virtual disk creation actually creates a file in the folder where your virtual machine resides. And that file can, in fact, go up to the size of your virtual machine. If we tick the box that says allocate all disk space now, then you will consume 60 gigabytes of storage space on your SSD, if you're using an SSD, reserved for that virtual machine. If we don't tick that, then it will only consume the space that is currently being used, and that is dynamically adjustable. So you, once you've installed Windows 10, it will probably be somewhere around about the 20 gigabytes in size, and the more you put in there, the greater the size will be, up to the maximum of whatever figure you put in here. I usually store the virtual disk as a single file. I'm not too concerned about splitting it up. It says here, splitting the disk makes it easier to move the virtual machine to another computer. But unfortunately, it may reduce performance with large disks. So I would rather use a single file, and I'm not using FAT32 file system, so I don't think I'll have any problems here. This is the name of the virtual disk. That's the file that gets created. I'll leave this as the default setting. And this is a summary of what will be done. So we can click Finish. The virtual machine will be created, and there is no virtual machine actually running. There's no operating system. We haven't installed it yet. So we can do that by editing the virtual machines. So we'll just slide this out. We can see here that we've got our library inventory. We've got my computer here, and we've got one virtual machine. Hovering over that shows the location of that virtual machine. If I go to that location in Windows Explorer, my folder is there for the virtual machine. I can open that up, and there are the files. So we've got a virtual disk file here, snapshot image files, we've got virtual machine configuration files. So that's all stays together as part of this virtual machine, and this will be important later to remember where all this is stored, and then we can have a look at exporting our virtual machines, and we can look at also the size of what goes on here as we progress through the installation. So I think that probably is enough for this video, and we'll resume in the next video with an installation of Windows 10. So thanks for watching, and I hope that you got some use out of this video. See you next time.